The evening air was warm and still, hanging heavy in the quiet Sacramento streets. The fluorescent lights inside the Save Mart flickered intermittently as the automatic doors opened, letting a cool breeze wash over the warm interior. It was early evening, and the store was sparsely populated. The hum of refrigeration units and the rustling of shopping carts were the only sounds filling the space. Vin Diesel, dressed casually in a gray hoodie and a low-brimmed baseball cap, moved quietly through the sliding doors, blending in with the few other shoppers scattered across the aisles. He didn't want attention. It was the kind of day he'd been craving. The kind where he wasn't the famous Hollywood actor, but just another person, quietly getting through his own business. His wireless earbuds were tucked snugly in place, not playing anything, but serving their purpose. He'd learned long ago that the best way to avoid unwanted conversation was to look like he was in his own world. As he pushed his cart down the first aisle, he passed by an older couple debating over the price of apples and a group of teenagers by the back shelf, loudly discussing energy drinks. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried, its voice echoing in the otherwise serene space. Vin felt a momentary comfort in the silence, one that allowed him to just exist without the prying eyes and constant noise of his celebrity life. He didn't come to Sacramento to make a public appearance or to be recognized. He had no meetings lined up, no scripts to rehearse. Today was for him just a quiet trip to the store. He wasn't looking for drama. He wasn't looking for confrontation. He just needed a few essentials. Then he'd head back to his hotel for some rest. Vin turned the corner into the frozen foods section, pushing his cart along the aisles, scanning the shelves for what he needed. It wasn't busy, just the hum of overhead lights and the occasional clink of a shopping cart. And then, just as he was reaching for a box of frozen vegetables, a different kind of sound pierced through the calm. At first, it was subtle, a murmur, a low, mocking tone, almost deliberate in its restraint. But as he turned his head slightly to get a glimpse, the sound became sharper, more distinct. 3 men were gathered near the self-checkout area, standing in front of a young black woman. Their voices were thick with ridicule, each word more biting than the last. Vin didn't know the woman's name yet, but he saw her in that moment, head slightly bowed, her hands clutching the small basket of groceries. She stood at the kiosk, trying to scan her items, but it was clear she was uncomfortable. Her name tag read LaToya, and Vin caught a glimpse of her face. She wasn't looking at the men. She wasn't looking at anyone. Her eyes were focused on the screen in front of her, probably trying to finish up quickly so she could go home to her child. But the men weren't letting her escape. They were laughing now, louder than before. The tone was cruel, taunting. With every cruel word, they mocked her appearance, her clothes, and her very presence. Vin's jaw tightened as the insults got louder. The words weren't just aimed at her, they were aimed at her identity. Racist slurs dripped from their lips, each syllable meant to wound, to cut deep. They thought it was a game. To them, she was just another target, someone they could humiliate, and they reveled in it. The people around them, other shoppers, employees, were silent. No one said a word. No one stepped in. The store, which had been so quiet moments ago, now seemed frozen in time, filled with the tension of unspoken discomfort. Vin knew what was happening. He saw it too often, in different forms, all over the world. This wasn't just bullying. This wasn't just a momentary lapse in judgment. This was about power, about seeing someone weaker and trying to break them down, knowing that no one would stand up. He could feel his blood boiling in his veins, the urge to step in and intervene rising like a tide. But it wasn't just the situation that troubled him. It was the realization that no one was doing anything to stop it. No one was intervening, not a single person in the store. The quiet acceptance of the bullying gnawed at him. Was this what the world had become? Vin wasn't the kind of man to ignore injustice, no matter how small the moment. He knew what it felt like to be judged, to be seen as less than because of where he came from, the color of his skin, or his career. And seeing this woman, Latoya, being torn down in front of others, without a single person standing up for her, pushed him past the point of silence. Without thinking, without hesitation, he moved. His footsteps were quiet but purposeful. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, but this had gone far enough. The men's taunts continued as he walked closer, louder now, their voices thick with cruelty. Vin reached the end of the aisle, just a few steps away from them, and he felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. He wasn't wearing a suit or a uniform. There was no title behind his name here, just a man who'd had enough. He wasn't here to be the hero. He wasn't here for recognition. He was here because what he saw was wrong, and he couldn't let it go. With a steady breath, he stepped into the aisle, his eyes fixed firmly on the three men who were laughing and jeering at Latoya. The room seemed to hush around him, as if the store itself was holding its breath. The first man noticed him and paused mid-sentence, his grin faltering. He didn't recognize Vin at first, but something in his demeanor made the others stop as well. Vin's presence, quiet but unshakable, had already changed the energy in the room. Vin took another step closer, and as the silence grew, he spoke, his voice calm and measured, but unmistakably firm. "Hey," he said, looking directly at the men. "You need to leave her alone." There was no fanfare, no dramatic flourish, just the weight of his words, steady and strong. The men hesitated, their smirks faltering, but one of them tried to brush it off, muttering something under his breath. Vin didn't move. He didn't back down. He simply stood there, his eyes unwavering, as if daring them to say another word. The atmosphere shifted again, the tension palpable in the air. And then, without another word, the men turned away, their bravado crumbling. They walked off, muttering among themselves, and the store seemed to exhale, the weight of the moment dissipating. Latoya, still standing at the self-checkout, hadn't moved. She didn't look up at Vin, but her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The quiet after the confrontation was almost as powerful as the moment itself. Vin stood there for a second, watching the men retreat. He didn't wait for applause, for gratitude. He didn't need any of that. All that mattered was that she was safe now. The silence that followed spoke volumes. He had done what needed to be done. Without saying another word, he turned back toward the frozen foods, grabbing his cart and walking away. No one followed him. No one clapped or cheered. But as he left the store, he knew the world had just shifted, even if only for a moment. And that was enough. Vin Diesel hadn't planned on being anyone's hero today. He was just another guy at the store, hoping for a quick in-and-out trip to pick up a few essentials. But something about the scene unfolding in front of him wouldn't let him walk away. He wasn't a man who ran from injustice, no matter how small it seemed. The cruel words from the men still echoed in his mind, and even after they left, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Latoya, the young woman at the self-checkout, still hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on the screen in front of her, but her body language had changed. Her posture, which had been tense and hunched under the weight of the verbal attack, had softened. She was still there, still present, but something had shifted in her demeanor. She wasn't facing the confrontation anymore. She was simply trying to get through it, get to the end of the moment without making a scene. Vin could see the exhaustion in her movements, the way her hands hovered above her cart, frozen for just a second, as if she were trying to figure out how to pick up where she left off, after everything had happened. It was clear that what had just occurred had affected her deeply, even if she didn't show it. He couldn't just walk away now. He'd already intervened, and while he wasn't the type to seek out praise or recognition, he felt a pull to make sure she was okay. That it hadn't been for nothing. That in some small way, she would know someone stood beside her in that moment of injustice. Taking a deep breath, Vin made his way toward the self-checkout area again. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't want to crowd her, didn't want to make her feel like he was prying. But he also didn't want to leave things hanging in the air, like some unfinished business. When he reached the checkout station, He stood a few feet behind her, just enough space to give her the room she might need. He didn't speak right away. For a moment, he simply observed her. Latoya had pulled a receipt from the kiosk, her face still shadowed, her eyes distant, as if she were trying to forget what had just happened. The emotional toll of what she'd endured, the sharpness of the insults, the cruelty of the taunts, was evident, even if she wasn't showing it outwardly. Vin knew what it felt like to have your dignity tested, to be publicly humiliated in ways no one could see. The times he had been told he wasn't good enough, that his career was a joke, that he was just another Hollywood stereotype. It had taken years to get to a place where he could rise above those voices. He wasn't the kind of man to let others control his narrative, but he also knew how much that kind of emotional assault could eat away at someone. He wasn't sure what Latoya had gone through, what her life had been like, but in this moment, he knew she was feeling the weight of something much deeper than just the insults. Without saying anything at first, he took a step closer, hoping she'd notice his presence before he spoke. When she finally looked up, her gaze met his. There was hesitation in her eyes, but there was also something else, something that he couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the quiet recognition that she wasn't alone anymore. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Vin said softly, his voice calm but unwavering. "No one should have to be treated like that. I hope you know you don't have to face this alone." Latoya's eyes softened, though the wariness in them didn't entirely fade. She nodded slowly, as if unsure of how to respond, but then her lips parted as if she wanted to say something. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, fragile, yet steady in its resolve. "Thank you," she said, her words heavy with gratitude, but also with something else, a vulnerability that she was clearly trying to mask. I've had my share of moments like this. And it's hard, you know. It's just hard to keep going when people make you feel like you don't matter." Vin nodded in understanding. He wasn't sure what her specific struggles had been, but he knew the weight of systemic injustice, the way people with power could sometimes treat others like they were invisible. He wasn't just some movie star, not in moments like this. He was a human, standing before her as someone who understood what it felt like to be the target of cruelty, the object of ridicule. "I get it," Vin said quietly. "Sometimes the world feels like it's designed to keep you down, to make you believe you don't matter. But you do. Every person does. And you're stronger than you know for putting up with this." Latoya took a deep breath, looking down at her receipt for a moment before meeting his gaze again. She smiled slightly, a small but genuine gesture. "Thanks. I didn't know if anyone would step in. It's not the first time something like this has happened." Her voice faltered, and for a brief moment she looked away, a mixture of pain and exhaustion flashing in her eyes. It gets tiring. You start wondering if anyone cares." Vin could hear the unspoken weight in her words, the years of invisible suffering, of being ignored, of having her worth questioned and erased. He knew he couldn't change the entire world in a moment, but this simple, quiet exchange felt like the kind of connection that mattered. In a world where silence often gave way to cruelty, this was a moment of standing up, of being seen. "I care," he said, his voice steady. "You matter. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." There was a brief silence between them, and then Latoya exhaled slowly, the tension in her body seeming to release just a little. She looked at him with a new sense of clarity, something in her eyes shifting. Maybe it was the weight of his words, or maybe it was the understanding that in this brief moment, someone had seen her as a person, not as a target, not as something to mock, but as someone deserving of respect and kindness. "Thank you," she said again, her voice still soft, but there was strength in it now. "I don't know what to say, but this means a lot." Vin gave her a small, reassuring nod. "You don't need to say anything. Just remember, you're not invisible." With one final look, he turned and began walking toward the exit. The store was still quiet, the normal hum of everyday life resuming, as if nothing had happened. But in that moment, something had changed. A single act of kindness had created a ripple, a moment that wouldn't be forgotten by either of them. Vin didn't need anyone to thank him. He didn't need recognition. He just needed to know that he had done the right thing. He had stepped up when others didn't. And that, in itself, was enough to change the world, even if it was just for Latoya in that one fleeting moment. As he exited the store, the warm Sacramento air hit him, and he let out a slow, steady breath. The world was still the same, but for a brief instant, it had been just a little bit better. And that was something worth holding on to. The days following the encounter at Save Mart felt different for both Vin and Latoya. For Vin, life had returned to its usual rhythm. He had wrapped up filming his latest project, taken some time for himself, and found peace in the simplicity of quiet moments like his grocery run. Yet the image of Latoya, standing there at the self-checkout, her shoulders hunched beneath the weight of what she had endured, lingered in his thoughts. He hadn't seen her again, and he doubted that their brief interaction would change her life in any grand, sweeping way. But something inside him, something deep and unshakable, told him that he couldn't just move on without knowing if she was okay. The world had a way of turning its back on the quiet, the invisible, the people who lived their lives unnoticed, constantly fighting an uphill battle against unfairness. And in that moment, when Vin had stood up to those bullies, he realized just how small this part had been in a much larger story. The world didn't change with one small act of kindness, but it could shift, even if only slightly, if more people chose to make that stand. Latoya, on the other hand, couldn't quite shake the memory of that evening. It had happened so quickly, just a fleeting moment in time. Really, but in that instant, something inside her had shifted. She hadn't expected someone like Vin Diesel, someone she had only ever seen on her TV screen, to step into her life in such a personal way. There were moments when the weight of everything, life as a single mother, dealing with the struggles of being a black woman in a world that wasn't always kind, felt unbearable. But that day, when Vin had stepped in, something inside her had been ignited. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She wasn't just another person in the store, another face to be ignored or looked down upon. She was someone worthy of respect, someone who deserved to be treated with dignity. But the reality of her situation had never been far behind. Latoya had been through enough in her life to know that moments like these didn't just come around often. People didn't change the world with a single act of kindness. She had learned it the hard way. So after Vin had left, she had gone back to her quiet routine, keeping her head down, focusing on the task at hand. Her son, Malik, needed her. The bills needed to be paid. The world kept turning, whether she was ready or not. But the encounter kept returning to her thoughts, unbidden. Vin's words had stayed with her. You matter. It had been simple, but there was something about it that resonated deeply within her. She thought about it more than she would admit to anyone, even herself. She began to wonder, what if it were true? What if, just for a second, she could believe that she mattered? That her struggle, her fight to make a better life for Malik, her attempts to find peace in a world that often seemed against her, what if it were worth something? Latoya's life hadn't been easy. Raised by a single mother in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, she had learned early on how to fight for what she needed, to survive. But the fight had taken its toll. After her own mother passed away, Latoya had found herself alone, raising her son in a world that seemed bent on tearing people like her down. Every day was a battle, a grind to make ends meet, to keep her son safe, to teach him that there was hope in the face of adversity. She had grown accustomed to the silence of others, to the stares, to the way people assumed things about her simply because of the color of her skin and the fact that she was a single mother. But nothing had ever prepared her for the cruelty she had encountered that day of the store. For a while after that encounter, she kept thinking about how the world would have continued spinning had Vin not stepped in. It wasn't just about the humiliation she had endured. It was about the people who had stayed silent. Everyone had seen it, heard it, But no one had spoken up. The shame of it hung over her, a reminder that people could be so quick to turn away from injustice when it didn't directly affect them. It had made her feel small. But then, Vin had stepped in. She found herself reflecting on what that meant for her son, for the kind of world she wanted Malik to grow up in. He deserved better. He deserved a world where people stood up for each other, where kindness was not just a rare occurrence but the norm. Days turned into weeks, and life slowly found its rhythm again. LaToya went back to work, putting in long hours at a local cafe, doing everything she could to make sure Malik had what he needed. She didn't have time to dwell on the past. There were always bills to pay, always something that needed to be done. But every now and then, the memory of that evening would come rushing back. The sound of Vin's voice, calm and steady, telling her that she mattered. She couldn't shake it. Meanwhile, Vin's world hadn't exactly slowed down. He had finished his latest project and was preparing for his next one. But something had shifted within him, too. After the encounter at the store, he found himself reflecting on the role he played in the world. For so long, his life had been defined by movies, by fame, by characters he portrayed on screen. But what if there was more he could do? What if he could be part of something that went beyond the glitz and glamour of Hollywood? He knew that one act of kindness, one moment of standing up, wasn't enough to change a broken system. But maybe it was the first step. Maybe it was the small act of defiance that could spark something larger. He didn't have the answers, but something inside him told him that he couldn't just sit by, waiting for the world to change on its own. He had the platform. He had the ability to make a difference. And as he thought about LaToya, about what she had gone through, he realized he wasn't done. The encounter at Save Mart had planted a seed inside him, a desire to do more. He couldn't stop thinking about the people who felt invisible, the ones who suffered in silence, the ones who had no one to stand up for them. He wasn't just Vin Diesel, the action star. He was a person, like everyone else, with the power to make a change. And maybe that change didn't have to be monumental. Maybe it could start with one small moment, one act of courage. Maybe it could start with him, using his voice to remind people that they mattered. And so, over the next few months, Vin began to speak out more, to share his thoughts on social media and in interviews about the importance of kindness, of standing up for others, of fighting against injustice. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't looking for praise. He was just one man, trying to do what he could, trying to make sure that moments like the one he witnessed at the grocery store didn't go unnoticed. As for LaToya, her life continued. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for change to come knocking. She had a son to raise, a life to build, and dreams to chase. But deep down, there was a fire that had been kindled, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible, that someone saw her, heard her, and cared. Vin Diesel's simple words had done more than just intervene in a moment of cruelty. They had lit a spark of hope that neither of them would ever forget. The weeks passed, and life seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. Vin went back to his hectic schedule, filming, traveling, and attending events, while LaToya continued her daily grind, trying to balance the needs of her son with the challenges of being a single mother in a world that didn't always seem to value her. Yet, something had changed for both of them. The encounter at the grocery store had planted seeds in their hearts that refused to stay dormant. For Vin, the idea of kindness had been an abstract concept before that day, something he tried to practice when he could, but something that often seemed like a fleeting thought in the face of the chaos of fame and daily life. But after meeting LaToya, it became more than just a passing gesture. The simple act of standing up to those men had awakened something in him, something deep within his core. He had always been a fighter on screen, but off-screen, he realized that there was more to his life than just playing heroes. His role in life could go beyond just entertaining millions. He could be a catalyst for change, a voice for those who couldn't always speak for themselves. It was a responsibility he had never fully embraced before, but now, with every new project he signed onto, With every new public appearance, the weight of that responsibility became more real. He started to get more involved in social issues that mattered to him. He began speaking out against racial injustice, supporting causes for single parents, and using his platform to amplify voices that often went unheard. In interviews, he would talk about the impact of small acts of kindness, reminding people that everyone had the power to make a difference, even if it was just by standing up when others chose to stay silent. But none of it felt quite as impactful as the brief moment he shared with LaToya. That brief, fleeting interaction in that grocery store had ignited a fire in him, and no matter how much he tried to fill his schedule with other things, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to be done. LaToya, too, had been affected by that moment. At first, she tried to carry on as usual. She kept her head down, buried herself in work, and focused on raising Malik. But as the days turned into weeks, she found herself thinking more and more about what Vin had said to her. She wasn't invisible. She mattered. These words, simple but profound, reverberated in her mind. At first, she thought it was just a fleeting moment of kindness from a famous actor, something that would fade as time passed. But the more she reflected on it, the more she realized that what he had said was true. Her life, her struggle, her existence, everything mattered. She mattered. And as she thought about it, she began to change the way she viewed her own worth. No longer would she allow herself to be diminished by the constant challenges she faced. The racial prejudice, the sneers, the moments of invisibility. It had all been weighing on her for years. But now she was beginning to see herself differently. She wasn't just a single mother struggling to make ends meet. She was someone deserving of respect, someone who had a right to take up space in the world. She was a fighter, and she would no longer let anyone tell her she wasn't enough. Her work life, though still difficult, started to change. LaToya had always been a hard worker, but now she had a new sense of determination. She began standing up for herself more at work, asking for better hours, and even pushing for a raise. She had nothing to lose. After all, she had been living in survival mode for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to ask for what she deserved. She felt more empowered, more confident, and she wasn't afraid to push for the things she needed anymore. But the biggest change came in how she parented Malik. LaToya had always tried to shield him from the struggles she faced, but she realized that she needed to raise him differently. She started talking to him more about the world, the beauty of it, but also the injustices they would inevitably face as Black people. She shared stories of resilience, of heroes who weren't just on TV screens, but were walking in everyday life. She wanted him to understand that being a good person didn't mean being silent when you saw something wrong. She wanted him to understand that kindness wasn't just a gesture, it was a revolution in itself. One evening after a long day at work, LaToya sat with Malik at their small kitchen table, a bowl of cereal between them. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside filled the air. Malik, who was only 8, was scribbling on a piece of paper, drawing shapes and coloring them in. LaToya watched him for a moment, her heart swelling with pride and tenderness. This little boy was everything to her. He was her reason for breathing, for pushing forward every single day. "Malik," she said, her voice gentle, "I want you to always remember something, okay?" He looked up at her, his wide eyes waiting for her to continue. "No matter what anyone tells you, you're important. Your voice matters. You can make a difference. Don't let anyone ever make you feel small or like you don't belong. The world needs people like you. You hear me?" Malik nodded, his small hands gripping the edges of his cereal bowl. He didn't fully understand it yet, but there was something in his mother's voice that made him take her words seriously. LaToya saw this and smiled softly. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Maybe this small moment, this change in her perspective, was enough to help her rebuild not only her life, but also her son's future. At the same time, Vin was continuing his own journey of change. He had been filming a new movie for the past few months, but when he wasn't on set, he was out in the world, making public appearances at rallies, supporting causes for racial justice, and speaking about his experiences with systemic inequality. He wasn't just talking about the issues, he was doing something about it. But even as he shared his own growth, he knew that it wasn't enough. He wanted to do more. He wanted to find a way to make a lasting impact on people like LaToya. People who didn't have the same resources, the same platform, but who still deserved to have their voices heard. One afternoon, as he was finishing up a meeting about an upcoming charity event, Vin had a thought. What if he could bring together people who cared, people who could help uplift voices like LaToya's? What if he could create a space where people who had been silenced could come together and share their stories? The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He didn't need to be the sole focus of everything. He just needed to help amplify the voices that needed to be heard. Vin began reaching out to people from different walks of life. Activists, educators, artists, anyone who had a story to tell or a cause to fight for. He knew that a project like this would take time and energy, but he was willing to give it everything he had. He wanted to build something that wasn't just about raising awareness, but about creating a movement that could make real change. It was time to stop being passive and start being active. As he made plans, he couldn't help but think back to the moment in the grocery store, the moment that had sparked something inside him. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew it was the right path. No more waiting. No more standing on the sidelines. It was time to act. The time for change was now. And it was time to give people like LaToya the space to be seen, to be heard, and to finally take their rightful place in the world. LaToya had been walking through life in a haze for so long, consumed by the relentless weight of her daily struggles, that she hadn't noticed how much her perspective had shifted until one day, when she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the glass door of a store. She was standing in front of a local supermarket, her arms full of bags, Malik at her side, and something unexpected washed over her. She was proud of herself. She wasn't just a woman enduring the hardships of life anymore. She wasn't just another black single mother fighting to survive. She was more than that. The road had been long, but somewhere along the way, she had learned to carry herself with a new kind of strength. Vin's simple words had planted a seed, but it had been her own growth, her own resilience, that had nurtured it into something more. Over time, she had built herself up, brick by brick, until she no longer felt invisible. Her efforts at work had paid off, and for the first time, she had gotten the raise she deserved. Her boss had acknowledged her work ethic, and although it wasn't a world-changing recognition, it was validation that she mattered, that she was capable of more. She had also started to stand up for herself in other areas of her life. People no longer pushed her around, not the way they once had. When someone tried to belittle her, she spoke up. When someone gave her a look of disdain, she held her head higher. It wasn't just about pride. It was about self-respect, something that had been buried under years of fighting to survive. Malik was watching her grow too. The changes weren't as obvious to him yet. He was still young, still learning, but LaToya could see the little shifts in him. He was becoming more confident in himself, less afraid to voice his opinions. He was starting to understand the value of kindness and the power of standing up for others, even in a world that wasn't always kind. She would often tell him about the day in the store when the world had nearly crushed her under the weight of cruelty, but how, in the end, someone had seen her. She shared that story with him, not just as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson. One day, when he was older, she hoped he would remember it, not just as a story about her, but as a reminder of the strength of the human spirit. Vin, meanwhile, was slowly building something bigger than just a movement. It had started small, just his posts on social media, his comments during interviews. But as time went on, the ripple effect began to spread. He wasn't just talking about kindness anymore. He was creating real initiatives, bringing together people who cared about making a difference. He knew that change couldn't happen without action, and that meant supporting people like LaToya, people whose lives were often invisible to the world, but whose stories held immense power. He started collaborating with organizations that fought against racial injustice, building platforms for people to tell their stories, creating safe spaces for voices that had been silenced for far too long. It wasn't about showcasing his own heroism. It was about empowering others to find their own voices, their own power. Vin didn't want to be seen as a savior. He wanted to be part of something bigger, something that could transform lives, one story at a time. His connection to LaToya's story had inspired him to focus his efforts more on raising awareness about the experiences of Black single mothers and others in marginalized communities. He became involved in initiatives that provided resources for single parents, helped communities access better education, and fought for equal opportunities. He used his platform not for praise, but to ensure that those whose struggles went unnoticed would have a chance to be seen. LaToya had never imagined that a moment in a grocery store could lead to such a shift in her life, and she certainly didn't know that Vin's actions would inspire a movement. But as her own life grew more grounded, more purposeful, she realized something else. Her fight, the one she had been waging for years, was part of a much larger battle. It wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about her son. It was about the generations before her, the ones who had fought for her to be here, and the generations to come. In the months that followed, LaToya's life continued to evolve. She found herself speaking more at community events, telling her story to others who had felt invisible, just like she had. It wasn't always easy, but each time she stood in front of a crowd, each time she shared her truth, she felt her confidence grow. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She had found a voice, a purpose, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was walking a path she had carved for herself. Malik was growing up, and she wanted to give him the best life possible. She wanted him to believe in his worth, to see the world as a place where he could be anything he dreamed of, no matter the obstacles in his way. She took every opportunity to teach him about resilience, about standing up for what's right, and about the importance of kindness. He was her future, and in his eyes, she saw everything she had ever worked for. Vin, too, continued to work tirelessly. He spoke out against injustice, advocated for those in need, and raised money for causes that mattered. But as much as he was doing in the public eye, he knew there was still so much more work to be done. Change wasn't something that happened overnight, and it certainly didn't happen because one person stood up in a grocery store. It happened because people took action, because they used their voices to amplify those who had been silenced. It happened when people like LaToya, like Malik, and like countless others, realized their worth. The small act of courage that had taken place in that grocery store had rippled outward, changing the lives of two people who had never expected their paths to cross. What started as an act of kindness in response to cruelty had blossomed into a movement that was about more than just fighting injustice. It was about recognizing the humanity in each other. It was about standing up when no one else would, and knowing that together, people had the power to change the world. LaToya's fight, her story, and her journey were far from over. But now she had the strength to face whatever came her way. She knew that, no matter how tough the road ahead might be, she was no longer alone. And in her heart, she carried with her the message that had been so carefully placed there by a stranger who had become a symbol of hope. You matter. And that was enough to light the way forward. As the months continued to pass, LaToya's life seemed to have blossomed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The quiet strength she had nurtured in the aftermath of the incident at the grocery store had not only empowered her, but also rippled through her community. She had never imagined that one simple act of kindness could set off such a series of events, but it had, and the impact was undeniable. LaToya had become an advocate in her own right. She was invited to speak at local events, where her story became a beacon of hope for those who had faced similar struggles. She began working with community organizations that supported single mothers and marginalized groups, using her own experiences to guide others through the difficulties of being overlooked, undervalued, and underestimated. She told her story not just as a woman who had endured hardship, but as a woman who had fought back against it, who had fought for herself and for her son, and who refused to let the world define her worth. In one of her speeches, LaToya spoke about the moment when Vin Diesel had stepped into the grocery store and stood up to those men. She spoke about the impact it had on her, how it made her realize that she wasn't invisible, that her voice mattered. And as she shared this story, she watched as the audience responded, their eyes wide with recognition and understanding. They too had felt invisible at times. They too had faced adversity and stood alone, waiting for someone to stand with them. Her words had the power to stir something deep within them, to ignite a fire of their own. Malik was growing up quickly, his innocence beginning to fade as he understood more about the world. But with LaToya's guidance, he was learning to navigate it with a sense of purpose and pride. She taught him to be kind, to fight for justice, and to never let anyone tell him what he was capable of. He was starting to become the young man she had always hoped he would be, confident, kind, and determined to make the world a better place. It was a slow and steady process, but every day she saw more and more of the person he was becoming. She could feel her own sense of accomplishment in him, the knowledge that, despite all the hardships they'd faced, they were both going to be okay. As the year passed, LaToya found herself becoming more involved with the broader community, expanding her reach, and finding new ways to create change. She began organizing events that brought together people from all walks of life to talk about their struggles and the ways they could support each other. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving, about lifting each other up and ensuring that no one had to face the world alone. Vin, too, was busy with his own journey. He had started to work on a new project, one that was much bigger than any movie he had ever been part of. He and several other high-profile celebrities and activists launched a nonprofit organization that focused on empowering marginalized communities, particularly those who had been victims of racial injustice. The organization raised funds for scholarships, mental health resources, and legal aid, and it worked closely with organizations that provided mentorship to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Vin knew that his platform was powerful, but he also knew that true change required more than just talking about it. It required action. He poured himself into the cause, using his fame to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. But even as he took on these new responsibilities, he never lost sight of the moment that had sparked everything. The moment when he had seen LaToya in the grocery store, struggling but standing tall, and how it had changed both of their lives forever. The two of them had never reconnected after that day, not directly, but they both felt the impact of their encounter every single day. They didn't need to meet again to understand that their lives had been intertwined in ways that neither of them had expected. Through their separate journeys, they had unknowingly become partners in a larger mission. Their stories were now part of something bigger than themselves, a collective movement that was changing the world, one person at a time. One evening, LaToya received a call that would forever alter the trajectory of her life. It was from a well-known philanthropist who had been following her journey and wanted to collaborate with her on a project. The philanthropist was impressed by her dedication to her community and her ability to inspire others, and they offered to sponsor a scholarship fund in her name to help young Black women who wanted to pursue careers in social work, advocacy, and activism. It was an opportunity she couldn't have dreamed of a year ago, and yet here it was, an opportunity to give back in a way that would help countless others. Tears welled up in LaToya's eyes as she listened to the offer. She had always wanted to help others, to make sure that no one else had to suffer in silence the way she had. And now she had the means to do it on a larger scale. She immediately thought of Malik, how one day he would look at her not just as his mother, but as a symbol of what it meant to overcome adversity, to rise above the limitations others try to place on you, and to make a difference. She agreed to the collaboration without hesitation, her heart swelling with gratitude and excitement. But as she hung up the phone, something inside her told her that this was just the beginning. This scholarship was only a small part of the larger vision she had for her life, and for the future she wanted to build for her son, and for other women like her. She had become a part of a bigger story, a story that would continue long after the headlines faded and long after the applause had died down. Vin's work had only just begun as well. His nonprofit was growing, and with it, his influence. But even as he became more entrenched in the work of social justice, he never forgot the day he stepped into that grocery store. He never forgot the woman who had been humiliated by those men, or the way she had stood her ground despite it all. It had been the catalyst for everything that had followed in his life. And now, as he stood before crowds at rallies and spoke at fundraising events, he realized something he hadn't fully grasped before. Change wasn't just about what you could do for others. It was about how you inspired others to act. The stories of people like LaToya and Malik had become the foundation for the change he was working toward. Every time he spoke, he told their stories, how they had risen from adversity, how they had fought back against injustice, how they had built something better out of the scraps life had given them. His organization wasn't just about helping people. It was about showing them that they, too, could be part of the solution, that they could be the change they wished to see. And as LaToya looked ahead, she knew that there was so much more to come. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving, and she was ready to make a difference in the world. She wasn't the same woman who had stood alone in the grocery store that day, humiliated and broken. She was now a warrior, a woman who knew her worth and who was ready to lead others toward a brighter future. Their journeys, intertwined in the most unexpected of ways, were a testament to the power of one small act of kindness. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a turning point that had sparked a revolution of love, empowerment, and change. A revolution that was still unfolding with each new day, each new story, and each new voice raised in solidarity. Together, they were proof that even in the face of cruelty, even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility for light to shine through.